Hello, this is part two of the lecture on stratification class and inequality. Um, just to recapitulate where we were, the class would be defined as a group of people that share some common economic situation broadly, not exactly. There are a number of ways to identify classes. Marx, you may recall, had a relational definition. It was about what your relation to the mode of production, whether you owned the means of production or you sold your labor to those that did. Uh, Others typically use a gradational approach where they divide the population into different groups based on some measurable variable like income or wealth. Usually this is done not on the basis of not looking at individual people, but individual households. Um, so I also discussed some of the reasons inequality has grown, showed you a couple of charts, but it's really, I think it's important to look at some additional quantitative data graphically, because just to illustrate the change over time in the distribution of income in the United States. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll go over a few things. Okay, this is a series of graphs I prepared a couple of years ago from current data that was current then, the most current that I could find. So before we begin, I need to share a few more or less statistical definitions and concept with you. Now, the spread of the variables of a given type, let's call whether it's height, weight, um, something quantitative of that nature that can be measured. Um, Generally, that entire spread, that range, is called a distribution. The distribution would be kind of described along this axis would be the particular value it had, like say it was height, you might have 6 feet here, 6'2", 6'3", 5'9", and so forth. And then this axis, the y-axis, would represent the proportion or number of individuals that shared that same value on the x-axis. For instance, this would be this, and if the distribution is a perfectly Gaussian distribution, it's called, that bell-shaped curve you may have heard about, it's going to have certain features regarding these things we call measures of central tendency, the mean, which is the average, the median, and the mode. So these are measures that kind of tell you where the center of the distribution is in some way. So that mean is the average. That's exactly what, if you know how to calculate an average, you know what that is. You add the number of, or you add up all of the measurements of that variable, divide by the number of measurements you have, and you have the average. And with a perfect distribution, the mean, the median, and the mode, which is the most common value, this one, are the same. The median is that value that divides the distribution in half. Now, if you had a different shape of a distribution, these things are not going to be equal to one another. Here's an example. This is an older estimate of the distribution of household income in the United States. You can see it doesn't look like a bell. It has a big hump and it slacks off until you get down here. Now what we have here are categories of household income. They're $5,000 wide. So all households with an income of 5,000 or less are this first bar. The second bar is 5,000 to 99.99 and so forth. Okay, at this time in 2010, the median household income was roughly $50,000. So that's the median. The average was a bit higher. The top 25% of households earned 85,000 or more. That you'd call that a quartile, dividing it into 4. The top 10% had incomes greater than 135,000, dividing by 10, that's a decile. you would have 10 deciles in the whole population. 10 times 10 equal 100%. So you see it slides considerably. Got a hump right here in generally $15,000 to $20,000 income level for the household. This is the working class and the working poor. The further you get down here, the more likely they might be in the group known as the working poor, which is the group that has trouble making ends meet, but they have a job, often a full-time job, but the salary is not adequate for their needs. Okay, then you get down here to, what is this, 200,000 or more? Starts to go back up again. And then 200, well, okay, this is $250,000 or more annual income. It's jumping again. So you can see this is not that bell-shaped curve. So if you just took an average of this, it would be higher than the median, and it would not describe very well what the center of the distribution is, which is better understood as the median. The median is more useful for data that is doesn't fit that bell-shaped curve. Okay, here's an example of how an average can distort what's going on. If you have a town of 500 people, 499 are paid $10,000 a year at a job. One person makes 10 million. You take the average, that comes out to $29,980. But only one person makes that much money and makes quite a bit more. Everyone else makes less. So this number wouldn't tell you much about the economic, the purchasing power of the people in town. There's only one person that approaches that. So the median, on the other hand, it would be that value that divided the whole population in two. To think of the median as lining everyone up in order based upon the values of some variable. In this case, it'd be income. So you line all 500 people up in a line, and it's all 10,000, 10,000. And then at the far end, Mr. or Ms. 10 million. So the midpoint's going to be 10,000 because that's what's going to lie in the middle of this line you've created by lining everyone up. So the median is that point, that number that more or less divides the population in two on the basis of some variable. Here's another example. Take these numbers, put them in order, ascending order. The number that's in the middle is 9. You have 4 here and 4 on the other side. 9 is the median. You can divide a population up or distribution up. The terms are almost synonymous here for our purposes in several ways. You can split it into 5 groups, each accounting for 20% of the population or distribution. 5 groups, if you split it into 5, each of these groups are called a quintile. Think of quintuplets, 5 children. You split it into 10, they're deciles, I meant that. And split it into 100, it's a percentile. You've probably heard of percentiles a lot relative to standardized tests. If something is at the 84th percentile, that means 84% of the, let's say your score on a standardized test is at the 84th percentile. That means 84% of the people who took that exam, that test, had a lower score than you. 16% had your score or higher. Okay. Here we have a little bit of a longer series up through 2016. I put this together in 2017, so this was as far as it went. I'll update these probably this summer. This is the mean, then this is average in this case. U.S. household income in 2016 adjusted dollars. That means it's adjusted for inflation, so it's constant, 1967 to 2016. Now this is the average within these quintiles. So first it's broken into groups of 5, and then an average is taken of that group of 5. So it's not quite as distorted. So what we see here, let's look at the 20% of households with the lowest income. That would be, we call that the first decile, perhaps. The 20th percentile would be the equivalent term. So what has been the trend in income between 1967 and 2015 for the 20% of the population with the lowest household incomes? Well, you can see it's barely changed at all over 48 years. And what about the 20 to 40%? Getting closer to the median. Well, a little bit, but not much. So here, this green one here is the 40 to 60%. So the median is in here somewhere. That would, because it would be the 50th percentile. And there's slight increase. You can see it's gone up a tad bit. Then this one, the 60 to 80%. So at this level, 80% of the population make less than whatever this number is, and that's probably about $85,000, $90,000, close to the other example I gave you. And it's gone up a bit. Now look at the top 20% of households, and their income has gone from roughly 110,000. Again, this is adjusted in constant dollars because there was some serious inflation in the late 1970s and quite a bit in the 60s as well, the late 60s particularly. So inflation is just an increase in prices that make the value of your income gradually decrease over time if you don't get an increase in your income. So 110,000 roughly in 67, over 200 in 2015. So that's almost a doubling of income over that period of time, when most other groups, 80%, have seen little or no increase in real income. Then let's look at the top 5%. That's the level at which 95% of households make less than that amount. 5% make more than whatever this number represents. So it hit 200,000 here, roughly in 73. Starting from maybe 180, it's now up about 360 or so. So again, it has doubled. It has doubled in this period. So you have a doubling. If you look at like the top 1%, it's even more dramatic. And then if you go to the 0.1%, there's been tremendous growth in incomes in those few households that have 0.1%, that make 0.1% of the that make up 0.1% of the distribution, the top 0.1%. This is another graph kind of looking at it from a different point. What share of total U.S. income do households have? And again, it's split into fives plus the top 5%. So the bottom 20%, those households making less than whatever that number was that we saw on the other. Anyway, you look at the percent share and you line up those numbers. Each household income would correspond to a certain percentage of the total U.S. income. So again, the bottom 20, we see actually a decrease, getting less of the overall income of the pie, the economic pie, all the money that's passed out in form of wages and dividends on stocks and so forth. So you see even if 60%, if you're at 60% or less of that level, it's gone down. Your share of the total income has gone down since 1967. Here we have the top 5%. You see their share has gone from like 16% up to around a quarter. Quarter of all income goes to the top 5% of earners. Okay. So, and this purple, that's the top 5% overall. So that's a larger number of people than this group. So this group is included in there. So the top 20% are getting almost half of the income in the United States. And the other 80% get the other half. Income growth. How much has your income been growing? We saw this chart earlier, I believe. So you can see the top, this is the percentage change since 1979, but only through 2007. This is considerably older, but the pattern has not changed much. I mentioned the ratio people often use to illustrate inequality, the ratio of the salary of the head of a corporation, the CEO, its chief executive officer, to the average salary in that corporation, which he or she is in charge of. And here's the percentage change in that ratio. Okay, percentage change for the top. Let's see. Oh, okay, this is pay rises, actually. How much your pay has increased. It's not the ratio. This is a different measure of that. CEOs overall, their income has increased since 1978 to 2014, it's gone up 10 times. You make 10 times more money in standard dollars, inflation adjusted dollars. Whereas for the typical worker, it's 11% as opposed to roughly 1,000%. So that's 100 times more. 100 times more than the worker. This is this is the winner take all effect I alerted to earlier. You have a gender gap in income distribution as well. Here we're back to the median income, pre-tax labor income. That means income from a job, doing work, not income from dividends or investments, stock and that sort of thing. Working age men versus working age women, and you can see the gender gap in, quite clearly. It's narrowed from what it had been in 62 considerably, but it's still in 2014 significant. The median income of all working women was maybe 22,000. For working men, it was about 35, a little over 35,000. Working age adults in total, the median is up. This is an individual now. The median reached high point in about 2002. This was right around the time of the dot-com crash and economic crisis of sorts, or shortly thereafter. It didn't have that great an impact on salaries and overall income. If your income is coming from labor, if you were making it on stock speculation, yeah, you lost a lot of money. But here, this 2008 financial crisis is right around here, and you see the median income go down. And in fact, as in the United States, we've just recently got back to the median income that, okay, if you look at just strictly hourly wages for production workers, non-supervisory employees, that basically is the working class. Anyone whose work is directed by someone else qualifies as working class. You look at their inflation adjusted wages since 1964, you see it going up to about, on an inflation adjusted basis, $23 per hour. But since like roughly 1970, let's say, the first of the oil crises, when gasoline began to become very expensive and union busting began, deregulation began, something called neoliberalism took hold, you see it falling overall to an average of about 19 and a quarter, roughly $19. And it's only been since 2019 that the inflation adjusted wages of working adults have reached the point they were at in 1970. So this is not all just the financial crisis of 2008. That was this little dip. Something else started happening in the 70s. And David Harvey would say that something was the advent and the dominance of a philosophy of politics and government and economics called neoliberalism, which I'll talk about in a moment. In the meantime, let us stop this. Okay. We also see inequality between races, ethnic groups, not simply class itself. Inequality is multidimensional. It has a gendered and a racial component. They all work together to affect an individual's life chances, they're called. The odds of getting what you want out of life, typically in materialistic society like ours, that is money, economic success. We'll talk more about this when we get to another lecture. Poverty. Poverty is closely related to inequality and social class. The poverty rate, you can see it is in 1959, it was up around 40%, dropped during the 60s, and began to go up again here. This is the number of people, not the rate. And this represents, well, the financial crisis, the recession, 2008, 2009. The rate is right here, the percentage of people, of households with incomes below the poverty line. Now, what is the poverty line, you may ask? Well, currently, the poverty line for a family of four is $25,250. So if you're a family of four, your household brings in less than $25,250, you are below the poverty line. You can probably get some sort of government assistance. If you have five, that's generally by a family of four. That could be a single mother and three children, or a couple and two children. Each additional child or child, fewer children, $4,420. Generally, single males and single females, for that matter, cannot get any sort of public assistance beyond food stamps temporarily. I was talking about median incomes in 2018. This is the most recent one I've looked up. We probably will have another one soon. 2018 median income in the United States was $61,937. That's inflation adjusted. In Texas, it was $59,206. That means half the households made less than that house, half the households made more. In Houston itself, the median income is $49,399. So, in case you wondered where we were in that, poverty rates by age. So here, age is another dimension of inequality and discrimination as well. So people age 65 and older used to have a significantly higher poverty rate than they do now. 36% of households headed by someone 65 or older were considered poor. Now, what you see here is the impact of Social Security payments kicking in, because when it was introduced, it didn't immediately give everyone much money at all. People had to build up credits in the system in order to get more than a certain floor. So you see it coming down here. There's also an impact of the United States economy was very good through here. People were making money. They were buying houses. Home ownership is the principal form of wealth for most households in the United States. It wasn't hard to buy a home. People did it. You can see generally it's down to around 9.3%. Used to be the highest, and we have adults 18 to 64 are a bit higher than those over 65, and households headed by people under 18, obvious, that's not so surprising that it's almost 20% of those households. Okay, here's something which shows the concentration of poverty. It's highest in the South, as you can see, the exception of New Mexico, which has a very high Native American population. And they don't tend not to be the wealthiest among us. So you can take a look at this later if you like. Piketty and Sayers, this chart we looked at, remember Piketty said the main driver of inequality was the difference in the returns you got from investing your money in stock or loaning it by buying bonds, for instance, and what one got through working for wages. The rate of increase of investment returns has been higher than the rate of increase of salaries, as we saw on that chart. So that, in his view, accounts for this widening gap between the extremely wealthy and the rest of us. Most upper income households, by that I mean maybe the top 1% or above, a lot of their wealth is in the form of stocks and bonds, and a lot of incomes, particularly when you get up to the 0.1 and the 0.01%. The lion's share of their income comes from stocks and bonds. Now, I've been flipping back and forth talking about income and wealth. Income is money you get on a regular basis coming in. Wealth is what you've managed to accumulate. For most families, most households in the United States, the base of that wealth would be a home ownership. You go up the income ladder, you're seeing more and more stock ownership, bond ownership, real estate holdings of various types, people who own several houses that are rented by others and get rental income. So anyway, I'm going to stop the share here. So I'm going to go back to the other lecture that I did not finish. If you have any questions, you can email them to me. All right. Okay. Now, economic inequality. This is roughly where we stopped before. Some of these political factors, that's more or less where neoliberalism comes in. Although it's not strictly political, it does involve power to an extent. Now, neoliberalism, that's basically David Harvey's definition. I'm just going to read it to you here. Neoliberalism is in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Now, that may sound similar to just basic Smithian liberalism, which is the classical. Neoliberalism is called neo because it is proposing rolling back changes that have occurred, rolling back regulations, the deregulation movement, weakening unions by deliberate actions on the part of corporate employers. Various political changes. We're reducing the social safety net, reducing the amount of money going to social programs, basically making the government weaker. So neoliberalism really kind of began with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Reagan wasn't so much a classic neoliberal as Margaret Thatcher in the UK was. Bill Clinton, definitely neoliberal. It was under his leadership that we enacted NAFTA, the trade agreement between, just a moment here. Hello.